Okay, so I've decided to do a slightly earlier live stream today because I'll be watching the Women's World Rugby League World Cup games later this evening, 5 o'clock my time here in the UK. If you pay attention, up in the corner there is a channel live stream poll that I've put up, so please feel free to have a vote in that. I may do other polls in regards to the Qatar World Cup. I think they could be very, very interesting. Um, there's been a lot of discussion around the Qatar World Cup and Sepp Blatter's comments they made in an interview to journalists in regards to the awarding of the World Cup to Qatar all those years ago, back in 2010, all those years ago. And more and more players are coming out and criticising FIFA and their FAs for going. And I think this is going to put a lot of pressure on sponsors long term, and depending on how this tournament goes, we could see several major sponsors of FIFA and the World Cup not renew their contracts going forward in the years and decades going forward, which would be very, very interesting. So we have to bear that in mind. Um, Obviously, you know, every major sporting tournament there has always been criticism. No sporting tournament has ever gone down perfectly. There has never been an Olympics or a World Cup or a World Championships where there isn't a bit of controversy or things that the organisers could have done better. We constantly talk about tournament legacies and reusing facilities after the said event. Let's say the Montreal Olympics in the 70s. The F1 circuit of Montreal uses the Olympic Park. Same in Sydney, they reused the Olympic Park. Melbourne, they've reused the Commonwealth Games and Olympic parks around Melbourne. So there's certain cities where that legacy, London, for example, where the facilities have either been modernised, reused, or continually being used to this day since the Olympics has been and gone. And there are other locations such as Rio, for example, and Athens, where facilities have been left quite literally to crumble into dust, um, and haven't been properly used and looked after in the years following an Olympic Games. For example, there's been criticisms of other World Cups as well, um, be it the playing surfaces at tournaments in rugby or football World Cups, going to certain locations like the 1978 World Cup in Argentina when there was the military government and the dirty war that was going on. This is not the first time FIFA has gone to a location with a dubious human rights record, and it will not be the last. But Sepp Blatter's comments, he heavily criticises Michel Platini, and is heavily critical of the fact they should have gone with the US back in 2010 for this World Cup. Now, the US is now co-hosting, obviously, with Canada and Mexico in 3.5 years' time in an expanded tournament format, which again has faced a lot of criticism from a lot of fans, going the tournament's now got too big. There's too much saturation. And so it's going to be interesting to see what the TV viewership figures are like, what the crowd attendance is actually in Qatar later on this month and into December are going to be like. The kickoff times, I mean, I'm not sold on a lot of kickoff times. I won't be able to watch every single game because of my job. This will be the first World Cup that I will not be able to watch every single game, which is frustrating, obviously, for the channel, but I do have a full time commitment with work, which is obviously where I get most of my income from at this current time is through my day job. So the kickoff times is frustrating, um, and I don't think they with the organisers, some of the comments that the organisers have said in regards to certain minority groups, and I don't think that's gone down well with the wider sporting community. There's been a lot of fan protests at games across, predominantly in Europe, and these protests are being led predominantly in Germany. They've been very, very visible and vocal with banners at games, which is very, very interesting. They've been very, very vocal and we are going to see a flashpoint incident at this World Cup. I have no doubt of protesters. I have no doubt in my mind that there's going to be some kind of banner or something's going to happen in the fan zone, and we are going to see a flashpoint incident at this upcoming World Cup in a couple of weeks. And it's going to be a flashpoint incident. It's going to make news. It's going to be a discussion-worthy incident. There is no hiding from it. The world's media are going to send on Qatar. Um, Literally in a couple of weeks, the world sports media and the world political media are going to quite literally descend upon Doha in Qatar in a couple of weeks, and there is going to be. I'm not a betting man, but I'll bet a tenner. I will bet a tenner that there will be a flashpoint incident, and it will be a high-profile incident because we know that 9 captains of European teams, including Harry Kane. I believe Gareth Bale of Wales or Aaron Ramsey. I don't know who's actually been named as squad captain for Wales, but I know England and Wales captains have said they're going to wear a pro human rights captain's armband in regards to the LGBTQ community, and of course the rights of that societal group are heavily restricted in Qatar, and they face heavy punishments and segregation in Qatar. The, the whole thing has basically, from the day that envelope was opened, all those years ago, to now, there has been huge eyebrows raised and questions raised throughout the the um, the entire time. Huge questions have been raised, and there was time to you know maybe withdraw the awarding of the World Cup to Qatar. There was time. Then contracts got signed, and it was at the moment that they went, well, it's going to be too hot to play in summer. We'll have to play in winter, and the disruption to domestic league seasons that was going to pose scheduling headaches. And this is before COVID. Look at the chaos we have seen, and look at all these players suddenly getting injuries and not being available. So yeah, Leon Goretzka, I've already seen his statement. Yes. That they're from a different planet. Well, Goretzka is of an immigrant background in Germany because Goretzka is not a very German name. As someone who was actually born in Germany, Goretzka is I think a more of a Basque name, I think. And Germany as a country has gone through a massive process since 1945 of healing and looking at itself and its own history and coming to terms with its own history between 1914 and 1945. It's a bit of a period where a lot of German historians look back with trepidation, and a lot of German people look at that period from the fall of the Kaiser all the way through to the fall of the Nazis, pretty much with awkwardness, but they've been more open and willing to not just embrace their past, but learn from their past. And Germany now is much like the UK, much more multicultural society than what it was, and a much more open society, and it's a much more progressive liberal society than what it ever was, even in the Roaring Twenties under Weimar. And Germany is a country that's gone through a lot of social upheaval and change over the last century. And that is expressed with their football team. That is expressed with all their sports teams, if you really look at it. Especially over the last, I'm going to say 15 to 20 years, there's been a more multicultural shift with their football team and the composition of their players and their players' backgrounds. And but he's not the most high-profile German player, but he is a high-profile player. He made a very high-profile statement in a press conference. He's allowed to do that. And yeah, I've read extracts of his press statement when he was being interviewed. I think it was after a game, and A lot of managers and a lot of players now being questioned on their views on going to the World Cup. And suddenly we're seeing all these players come down with injuries that normally in a normal circumstance they would be on light duties for a week or two rested. And yeah, it's an interesting. This is the politicisation of sport we've seen in recent years, and I've noticed it with the rugby league coverage. I'm a massive rugby league fan, but I've noticed it with our World Cup coverage of the rugby league on BBC. It is painful. They don't have. I mean, they're not always putting the best commentators or the best presenters for the job, which is a bit frustrating. Um, and some of the commentators are making very basic mistakes. Uh, and you're thinking Gary from the pub could do better. And when you're thinking that, you're thinking, okay. Um, and I've got my own criticisms of the Rugby League World Cup. That obviously, um, as a fan who's watched as many games, I only missed a couple of games. As a fan of rugby league, I've been I've got some criticisms that I will be stating about that. I haven't watched the Qatar State of Field, although I do have it. I do have the ITV Players ITV Hub account, so I'll probably give that a watch on the iPlayer this evening. There's a few other documentaries I want to watch as well in regards to sport and politics at the moment. So that's something on my watch list. But the concerns that I have is the fan engagement is going to be poor. I don't care where a tournament's being played. If the fan engagement is poor, that's a bad selling point. Yes, the BBC and ITV. It's basically a formality that they secure these rights. It's just officially they've secured them because they're protected TV rights that have to be shown on free to air TV under a broadcast agreement. That's basically a government law, pretty much. It's just a formality of which free to air broadcasters get the rights because it could be Channel 4, for example. Channel 5 could have secured the rights, but it has to be a free to air broadcaster. It cannot go behind a paywall. That is the key thing. And the Six Nations has seen that threat of possibly going behind a paywall, like the Autumn Internationals Rugby Union have with Amazon, because of certain grading of sporting events, such as the Olympics and World Cup and Euros football, for example. Which is interesting because now we've got the Nations League on Channel 4. But now, as we've got it on free to air TV and more people are exposed to the Nations League and the format and how players were really disinterested this season, well, I wonder what those viewing figures are like. And we've now seen the Super League get limited rights on Channel 4 as on free to air coverage as well, sort of copying the Australian model, which I think we should have done from the beginning, way back when in the mid 90s. But of course, the powers that be got greedy and now the game is on its knees. But yeah, so the BBC ITV thing, it was just which free to air broadcasters would be given the rights, basically. That's pretty much what that is. It's a formality of just naming two free to air broadcasters because it has to be two, it has to be shared rights. And for the most part, it's been BBC and ITV for forever, pretty much, especially in my lifetime. However, it could have been Channel 4, it could have been Channel 5, it could have been one of the Freeview channels, could have got the rights. Free Sports could have got in there hypothetically. It's a formality that they've been named. Um, And I think they've also secured the rights to the next World Cup as well. It's every few years this comes up for two tournaments in a row. They secure the rights. It's a formality, so don't worry about that. People go, "Oh yes, it hasn't gone to Sky." Although I do think the viewership figures for this upcoming tournament will be telling as well. Um, the time of year it's taking place, some of the kick-off times as well, where the tournament's been hosted, and already we've seen this negative fan engagement for many years, not just here in the UK but across Europe and in North America, which is a key growth market for the global international game, because there's been negative feedback coming out of the US, and there has been that political element with the corruption scandal into FIFA in 2015. That has had a massive run in the US media for 7-8 years, and it's been highly politicized because the FBI got in. That you now see, excuse me, the fan engagement in the US, which is a key growth market, Canada, which is a key growth market for FIFA, with obviously the next World Cup being co-hosted in Canada, US, and Mexico, and with no more professional teams springing up, the professional game growing, etc., etc. That with negative fan engagement and a lot of criticism of the tournament going into the tournament. Um, yeah. Do I think it's a bad thing? Well, look, they did it with England 20 years ago, and it didn't last very long. All the other autumn internationals were kept on free to wear at the time, at the turn of the century in the early 2000s, and they did it for a couple of seasons with England, and they watched the viewership figures plummet. And very, very quickly they were brought back onto free to air BBC coverage, and then put on Sky for a bit again. But there was always dual coverage. Um, they also did that for the England Six Nations games as well, and viewership figures and engagement with fans plummeted. I think it is a bad idea, considering what's happening with the club game right now. You need as much fan engagement and as many eyes on your sport as possible. And with what's happening with Wasps and Worcester, and what is happening with my mullet. Look at this mullet. Look at it. Look at it. I feel like Jeff Burton from Metallica. I do think it's bad that the Rugby Autumn Internationals have gone behind a paywall on Amazon. I was never keen on the idea, but that's CVC for you. That's having that capitalist investment, venture capitalists involved with financing the game. This is because rugby union's professionalism has expanded too rapidly and hasn't really been structured very well. And this is what I keep going back to this 2019 World Rugby election with Augustine Pichot and Bill Beaumont. And Augustine Pichot was right. This was one of the outcomes, was pricing out average fans and new fans from the game from poorer socio-economic backgrounds. And we end up with the situation where about a third of rugby union international games are now no longer accessible to the average fan, at least in this country. But then you look at the French TV deal, it's exactly the same. The French football TV deal for the French domestic league is exactly the same. It's a mess. There is clearly what the pandemic has highlighted. And I'll bear in mind, this Amazon deal was agreed in 2019. The mess that certain sports inherited before the pandemic, going through the pandemic, has been highlighted. The poor, very, very poor structures in place, and the imbalance of payments, and teams and unions and federations massively overextending themselves for decades. And when times were good, they were getting away with it. But as soon as times are bad and there is a sudden stop in finance, a stop in revenues to cover losses, they unsecured debt's what it is. But I do think it's bad. I can see. I don't mind paying for some online subscription services. And I do say this because I do have my NRL subscription. Next year, I'll be getting my V8 Aussie Supercars subscription because I don't actually have a working TV aerial and satellite dish in my block of flats, so it's pointless having my TV. So I do obviously. There are certain subscriptions which I think are value for money, and I do think because they are through mainstream sports media companies anyway, that if I had a working satellite and a working TV area, I would be watching on the TV. But I have certain companies and certain company practices, and I do find this with sponsors as well. I don't agree with, and I do not agree with Elon Musk, Tesla, and Twitter at the moment, which I will be getting rid of my Twitter account in coming days because just the guy's a bond villain. I'm shopping less on Amazon. I'll never buy through Amazon store. I always buy through the independent retailer who advertises on Amazon, which is key. So Amazon gets less money from me that way. So I don't have Amazon Prime. I refuse to get Amazon Prime, even though I could watch the Grand Tour and Clarkson's Farm and all that. And I do think certain sports going. I mean, the Premier League package on Amazon is all the games that no one wants to watch anyway. They're the crap that no one wants. That's why Amazon got them cheap. And they're all the Boxing Day fixtures. I mean, Boxing Day. I'm probably actually going to be working this Boxing Day, so there's that. Worst of a mullet was 80s Aussie Rules football player John Platt, and I have seen photos of that, although there are some NHL mullets from the 80s that are pretty horrific. Martin McSorley is a good one. Um, I hope. Well, yeah. I mean, I've got a week off work, booked holiday time, vacation time. Um, I've not really been doing much, to be fair. I've been to the post office to post some legal documents to the driving standards agency, DVLA, because I got rid of my motorbike. Um, but otherwise, I haven't really been doing. I've got to do some important paperwork for work, but I want to leave my job. So I don't really care. I've tuned out of work now. I've completely tuned out. I think that the culture at my workplace is so negative that we have to do this workplace survey, and or when I get it done, they're not going to like what I'm going to put. Um, but no, I do think that, yeah, going back to subscription services. Yes, I have Netflix. Yes, I have my NRL account. Next year, I will be getting my AFL and Aussie V8 Supercar accounts as well, um, which are pretty cool. But they are legitimate through the sports broadcast agreements that we already have, and so it's not for me. And they're value for money. They really are value for money. They're a lot cheaper than buying a Sky TV package in this country, or a cable or Fox package, or Bailey Sports, I think it is in the US. So there are costs with that as well. I've done my costing, and it is value for money. What I'm paying, a lot cheaper than getting a Sky Sports, BT Sport, or if I was living in the US or Canada, a Sportsnet, or a TSN, or an ESPN subscription, cable, whatever. Um, so there is that. What sports have done well and bad since the pandemic? A lot of sports have. I think a lot of sports have had to realise they've had to change how they operate. Um, I don't think any sports come out of the pandemic unscathed. What we have seen is some sports have definitely adjusted how the sport is played or participated to those rule changes. So the NRL and rugby league in general, if you've been watching the Rugby League World Cup, you've noticed the 6 again rule, which the NRL's had now for a couple of years, but we haven't seen in the Super League. So they brought in some rule changes. I think they're good rule changes. They need more time to bed in, and teams to adapt, and players to adapt, and coaches to adapt, and even fans to get used to. Change is always a big thing, and it takes a while to adapt. But the sport had to evolve. It was slowing down, it was sloppy, it was scrappy. So the NRL and rugby league in general has brought in some rule changes. I think that has benefited the game, not so much in the short term, but I think in the long term is more of a benefit. So there's that. Um, the NHL and NBA have finally caved in and put sponsors on jerseys, and I'm not sure how American fans feel about that. As European fans, we're used to having sponsorship. I should really do a comparison between one of my UK ice hockey jerseys and one of my NHL jerseys. This is what sponsorship really looks like. And for those US and Canadian fans that are blowing up about a little patch here, a little patch on the helmet, have no idea how ugly some of our jerseys are with all the sponsors. So um, certain leagues in the North American sports leagues now finally, eventually, gone. We're going to have sponsors on jerseys. The relaxation of gambling laws across the US at a federal level have brought in a lot of income to a lot of the major leagues, for good and for bad, and you can read into that what you will. But I don't think any sport's done perfectly at the pandemic. Though. I mean, golf is at war with itself. F1, they've changed, spending cap rules, and they've had their controversies. They've dropped races from the calendar. They've brought races back. They're threatening to drop more races from the calendar, and they've gone in a more US centric direction, which I don't think is actually going to help the sport long term. I think F1's image has gone down the toilet. The the World Cup anyway was going to be played at this time of year, but the fixture congestion has been highlighted and exacerbated by the pandemic. I'm surprised more teams haven't gone under, sports teams in general, just across all sports. I'm surprised only a handful of teams have gone out of business, at least in the UK. I don't know about other countries around the world, but We've lost a couple of football clubs and we've lost a couple of rugby clubs. And other clubs are now we've had more reports coming out about rugby union where there's another 4 or 5 clubs in the Premiership that are basically bankrupt. Is a good way to put it? It's a nice in layman's terms, but they've got structured, unstructured, and serviceable, unserviceable debt. And in the short to medium term, I don't think they can service that debt. And a lot of it to do with government loans that have been given since March 2020. And so some high-profile clubs are in serious trouble, and it's snowballing. Worcester started it, then Wasps, but Wasps had problems before the pandemic. Exeter Chiefs, I think London Irish, Harlequins, Northampton, that they are starting to all flash red. I think Saracens and Leicester, 2 salary cap breaching clubs, seem to be ironically in a better position than the clubs that have obeyed the financial rules. But majority of the Premiership looks likely to go out of business unless the RFU steps in now and they change their administration rules, because otherwise we're not going to have a domestic season to complete. But I am surprised it's taken the best part of nearly 3 years to reach this point in rugby union. But rugby union's in real crisis. The Rugby League World Cup, there is some government money involved with that. And this was the worst case scenario for the organisers, was delaying by 12 months. They were prepared to go ahead with no fans in attendance last year, and of course New Zealand and Australia pulled out midway through September last year. The way that was handled was bad, but in hindsight was the right decision. Cricket's been a mess, quite frankly. Absolute shambles is cricket. There's a lot of scandal with cricket anyway. We've had the racism scandals and the sexting scandal with Australia, and now we've had the Sri Lankan tour scandal in the T20 World Cup with everything that's coming out about that, which is not good. We've had players sacked, captains dropped, coaches sacked, directors sacked. Cricket's just one scandal after another anyway. Oh, my bloody phone's going on. No, it's nothing important. It's just Instagram. Oh. But yeah, there's motorsport has had to completely change itself. Tennis, obviously Djokovic, and a few other players in the Australian Open at the beginning of the year, and all that. Hoo-ha about, is he allowed in? Is his visa rejected? There were several players actually, but Djokovic was the one that really everyone focused on, and is that hampering his career going forwards? I don't think any sports come out of this healthy. Look at football, or soccer, as the North Americans and Australians will call it, with what's happened with Barcelona, Real Madrid, and Juventus, and the European Super League they attempted last year, and the debts, and then now there are clubs physically on their knees. There are clubs that owe players money. There's unpaid debts. There's obviously this World Cup. Going into this World Cup, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement, the politicisation of sport. There's a lot of problems. So I don't think any sport's done really well, to be honest, coming out of the pandemic. Certain sports have actually had bumper profits with the relaxation of betting laws, especially in the US and Canada, and betting sponsorship, which is a concern for me long term. We obviously some crowd numbers have surged, but then we have to discuss ticket prices. And in reality, if crowds are up, that's fine, and viewership figures at home are up, is fine. But because prices may have been reduced in the short to medium term, are actually profits up? Which the answer is no. We're now seeing the NRL and the NRLPA, the CBA. There's loggerheads there, which has meant the Australian Rugby League Commission, Peter V'landys, and the NRL CEO Andrew Abdo have left England. They were, I think, up in Manchester or London. They've flown back to Australia. They're now getting involved with Players Association heads, and they're getting around the negotiation table. Even though the NRL CBA isn't up for a couple more years, there's things going on there that can involve court litigation and lockouts and player strikes. This is in the middle of expansion. They've got a new team joining. I should get out of my job and do something. That's the plan. I'm keeping it slightly under wraps what I plan to do, but I'm planning to retraining another career, and I'm planning to emigrate out of the UK within the next couple of years. That's the plan. Although reality could be a lot different. It could just be a job changing salary, and maybe moving, and relocating. The England World Cup squad. I mean, like, I'm surprised by the fact that you know the favourites are still in there. I think Southgate's going into this tournament under the back of a lot of pressure, and I think Alan Shearer, I think, and some other pundits said quarterfinals where we're probably going to get. We may not get out of the group. Um, Whatever happens, I think this is Gareth Southgate's last tournament. I don't think he's there for Euro 2024. I do not think he's there at the next major tournament. With how the Nations League campaign went and how badly England have played since the last tournament, there's been a very marked drop off in morale, performance, style of play, and for all those saying, "Oh, we're all behind the team," in the World Cup in 2018 and in last year, there were some green shoots there, but I was never sold up from Southgate's first game against. I think it was against Lithuania. I think I covered it on the channel. It may be one of his first games. One of the first match reviews I did on the channel was England Lithuania. It was a 1-0 to England. It was a shocking game. And this is like 5 years ago. Yeah, it's 5 years ago almost to the day. England played Lithuania. I think it was in a qualifier, and it was a really, really poor game. Really poor. And I remember in that match review, I was heavily critical of the style of play we were playing. We were playing against much weaker opposition, and we had some fast, talented, wide players. We could have moved the opposition around, and it was a slow, pointless, almost anal passing for passing's sake. There was no pace on the ball. There was no movement off the ball. And I'm thinking, this is really stale. I know at the time he was put in, it was very early on, but you would want to see, like, this is what I want to play. Then, of course, the World Cup comes in 2018. Of course, we do make it to the semi-finals, and it is an improvement from where we were. And there were some green shoots there. I think we overachieved in 2018. And then in the build-up to the delayed Euros last year, again, those green shoots were there. And, of course, we did have a very good tournament. We started playing to the team's strengths, and then tactical blunders by Southgate in that tournament were highlighted in the worst case possible, which was the final and the game against Scotland. And the problem lies with the FA. Unfortunately, there's no one really available who's English, because I think a lot of fans want an English manager, but who do you get in? Because Potter's now at Chelsea, although he was tied up at Brighton. Eddie Howe is tied up. I know Gerrard is now available, but he didn't have the best spell at Villa, although he had a good spell at Rangers. Lampard's at Everton. They want a young English manager. There aren't that many young English managers available who also have enough experience at managerial level with a reasonable amount of success and working with high profile players. Maybe Gerrard and Lampard, but Rooney's tied up in the US and has decided to commit long term to the MLS and learn his trade properly, although he did a very good job at Derby under very testing circumstances, in my personal opinion. And I don't think any of them are really ready to take on the job. So I don't know. We've tried the overseas experiment. It did not work. We tried it with Sven. There were patches with Sven where it was really good, and we did have a very good squad at the time and some really good players. And then there were patches with Sven where the wheels did come off. And then we tried it with Capello, and there were, again, spells where it was good. We were solid at the back. We worked hard for each other. There was the fitness improved, the technical ability improved, but the tactics didn't work with the players we had available, and the wheels fell off. Roy Hodgson was just thrown under the bus because he had to take over in a situation with only a few weeks before a tournament. And there were people earlier this year saying, get rid of Southgate. we'll end up with another Roy Hodgson situation where an interim manager is put into the situation going into a tournament with no certainty over his position, and the players will have no certainty over the style of play, the tactics employed. No ideal. So that, and there's still players going down injured now. So even though the World Cup squad's been announced, I bet you that changes, and there will be reserve players called up, and there are players who are not in that squad who should be, and there's players in that squad who shouldn't be. And it's down to Southgate keeping. I mean, how Pickford's in that team is beyond me. How Maguire's in that team, sure. I mean, there are some players around that squad who shouldn't even be near a Premier League bench at the moment. And I'm saying that with due respect because obviously they're better at the game than I am, and they're better than I'll ever be at playing the game. But Southgate, when he was appointed, stated this: "I will select players on form, not favouritism." And the Maguire situation over the last 2 years, and I do have sympathy for Harry Maguire. I can be critical of his performances and go, look, his confidence is shot. Let's get him out of there. Get him out of that contract. Quite frankly, he should never have signed that contract. Leicester are rubbing their hands with Lee, going, look how much money we've made off an average player. But he's been put in a position by several Man United managers and his national manager, which he shouldn't be in. The abuse he's received is, I think, completely unnecessary, but that's social media for you. But the criticism, I think, is justified that he's just not good. He's solid, not outstanding. And he's been put in that position totally unfair. Pickford's not had a good time at Everton form-wise in comparison to Ramsdale and Pope. In comparison to what he does in his position, but somehow he's still England's number one. He has deficiencies in his game that while he makes up with good shot stopping and good aggression, and he's a very positive, aggressive goalkeeper, he doesn't command his box very well. So there's a tactical flaw in his game. There's an actual flaw in his game, which is an issue, and he's not the tallest. So he has to make up for his lack of height with extreme athleticism, but he is a very hot-headed player. He has issues within his game that have been highlighted at club and international in the past. I would go with Ramsdale. He's playing much better right now. So there is that. I understand that obviously. I do think these are provisional squads as well. Players aren't suspended as of yet. I think this weekend's the last bout of games we're going to have. I think before players suspended or midweek games next week. We've already had the first round proper of the FA Cup play, which is a bit early. So there is a lot of the problems I think we are going to face is more players will go down injured in training because training hasn't been suspended yet either. We're going to see players pick up. I mean, they've had to wedge in League Cup games, FA Cup games. They've had to completely ram the beginning schedule of the European season. We're going to see the second half of the season heavily congested as well. We're going to see a lot of players go down injured, and people go, "Oh, but they're paid. All they do is run around, for 90 minutes, a couple of days a week, and then do their training for a couple of hours a week, and that's their job." Ironically, to be a top-level professional, you've got to run a marathon every day. You've got to be physically fit. You've got to be able to put up. It's a contact sport. I mean, people actually think it's actually not that as physically demanding on the body as it actually is. It's being a football player. I've got mates who played semi-pro and I know some people who've gone through academies and all that. Their bodies are wrecked, and when you see a young player coming through, they're never fully fit. No football player is ever fully fit, ever. And I know some football players and some of their injuries. And you look at some of the ex-players, and you see their knee injuries where they've had knee operations, and you see the scar, and you see where they've had knee and ankle operations and hip operations. They're carrying injuries from their teenage years all the way through their 30s. No football player is fully fit ever. Ever. Let that sink in. And you'll see, uh, there's like one of George Best's contemporaries, one of his girlfriends, I think, from the 70s, was like, she would notice all the dents and dings and chunks out of his legs. And this is before shin pads were compulsory. Let that sink in. No player in any sport is at any point fully fit, ever. And as someone who played amateur rugby, I can tell you that for my first training session, I was carrying a knee injury for the entire season. So when we're talking about, I mean, this World Cup, I do think some players are going to be listed as injured by their clubs, and technically they're boycotted. I I think what is going to be interesting as I fear is the viewership figures on TV, because that's going to be the telling. And that's where the sponsors and the advertisers will be like, do we want to be associated with FIFA going forward? They've made this decision. They've gone to this location. They clearly endorsed human rights abuses. And I think this is going to be a very politically charged World Cup. I can see the fact that so many high profile players have come out and spoken critically of the organisation and been critical of statements made by the organisers and hosting it in this country. It is interesting. And then we've got ex players, and Sepp Blatter's comments haven't helped the situation, because at no point does he highlight the issues with human rights abuses within the country. And when I say human rights abuses, I say post 45. Every country is a bit guilty of some, but of having certain laws that aren't great. I mean, every country since 1945 has been every country's been guilty of like at least one human rights abuse of some bloody kind. Um, but the, the the I think the negativity surrounding this tournament has been there from the day it was awarded. I could accept Russia back in 2018 getting the World Cup. I could accept the Russians for their sporting history, and then now what we now know about their doping, and obviously what's happened with Ukraine is separate. But um, Russia's got a sporting pedigree. Qatar does not. The it, it's a difficult one, because a lot of the country. I mean, FIFA's had history here before as well. The '78 World Cup in Argentina. At the time, there was a military dictatorship. There was massive civil rights abuses in Argentina. There were 10,000 people were kidnapped by the military government and murdered, and imprisoned illegally. So I watched a documentary on that. That's stunning in itself. And they willingly went there. They went twice to Mexico, bearing in mind that in the 70 World Cup, at the time of the 1970 World Cup, there was a military government in charge and a brutal, repressive government in charge. 86 was slightly different, but there's been civil rights abuses in Mexico for years. South Africa, obviously, yes, the legacy of apartheid, we know about that. But they've been going to countries that have dubious records with corruption and human rights for years. This one, however, is the big one, because it's not that they've had them in the past and they've held up and they've had their civil rights movements and they put the civil rights abusers on trial, and the military governments, the dictators, or the corrupt. This is still ongoing, and we've seen. It's a difficult one, because we if this was the Women's World Cup, for example, or a women's tournament, players have said they would outright refuse to go. And we can all people go on and bash the women's game, and I think that's completely unfair. But when you've got some high profile players in the women's game going, if this was a women's World Cup, I'm flat out refusing to go. I don't think we should go. I'm using this as a platform to say that I do have some concerns about women's rights, gay rights, basic human rights, all sorts. And then we hear about the cost of how much it's costing fans to go there. It's obscene, absolutely obscene. And I do think FIFA is going to regret their decision massively, not just in the short term, but in the long term. I think the reputation of FIFA, what we now know, obviously from 2015 onwards with the FBI, as I've said before, the the reputation of the organisation's damaged anyway. I think this will damage it more, more. Um, and then we haven't even discussed what the quality of play is going to be like. Is it going to be a good tournament on the field? Because here's the thing: since the last World Cup, we've had COVID. Okay, so the players have basically had a year and a half playing in empty or half empty stadiums. So actually, I do think having low crowd numbers will not be a problem. Had we not had COVID, that would have been a problem. The lack of atmosphere. We've had whole periods of seasons with no fans in attendance or limited attendances across the world under COVID protocols. And that's something that I think will serve the players in good stead, having those reduced capacity crowds or low crowds. Um, I do. Well, I mentioned that earlier in the stream. I do think there's going to be an instant. If Harry Kane and those other 8 captains wear those rainbow armbands, that's going to pose an incident. We've already seen one protester who's already gone out ahead of the World Cup to protest against human rights abuses against various subsections of society, has been detained. There's been a lot of Foreign Office advice for a lot of countries to travelling fans saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't get caught with drugs. Like, if you are going to take Class A and Class B drugs or Schedule 1, Schedule 2 drugs into a country like Qatar, you deserve to have your hands chopped off, in my opinion, because that is just brainless. I know I've waffled a bit for the last like half hour, but no, yes, there is going to be an instant. I think there is going to be a reporter who's going to ask that difficult question, or there's going to be that press conference, or there's going to be that fan instant where it is literally a fan goes outside of a fan zone with a beer, or there is an unmarried couple of a man and a woman who aren't married holding hands. Something as simple as that, which happens quite regularly in Dubai and Qatar and Bahrain on a regular basis anyway, when there's that slight faux pas. There is going to be that incident. And I think it will be triggered by a minority group. I do think it's going to be triggered by possibly the LGBTQ community. There may be a protest. There may be that awkward question asked by a reporter that blows up and it becomes ugly. Um, and I do think it could happen very early on in the tournament. How the organisers respond to that and how FIFA respond to that, bearing in mind the world's media is now focused on a small Middle Eastern country which has already got tense relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia politically in the region anyway, two of its big neighbours. There's already tension in the region geopolitically for commercial reasons, geopolitical reasons, TV rights deals, and a lot of it's to do with football as well. Ironically, there's a lot of tension already in the region politically with its neighbours, and Iran and Saudi Arabia have qualified for the tournament, so that's interesting. There is something, and I do fear that there will be a trigger point. Now, whether it's fans misbehaving, you're going to be stupid to misbehave over there. Really, you are. But if it's a fan in a fan zone or a designated Western area, and they accidentally go outside of an alcohol-controlled zone with a bottle of it, that could be, a small incident, nothing major. But I do feel like a young unmarried couple who've decided to go to the tournament from one of the Western nations, and they're caught holding hands. That is punishable by fines and visa withdrawals and imprisonment and expulsion. There's going to be a flashpoint incident where there's a clash of cultures. Now, something is going to happen. Now, we know fans, hooligans, can't behave themselves. I would think having it, there's going to be a flashpoint incident. There is that. I bet the organisers are praying that nothing happens, and I think that's FIFA. I think the organisers, the Qatari government, are going to just do what they're going to do. They're not going to suspend their laws. They're not going to alter their laws. I think they've altered a few laws for the durations, but there's going to be a flashpoint incident. It's going to be high profile. It's going to be big. It's definitely going to flare up. And I don't think it's going to be a hooligan element that's going to do it. It's going to be a minority group that gets targeted by an overzealous police officer. Someone's going to wear a T-shirt with some slogan on it that may be deemed offensive under local laws. Something very trivial that we would see as trivial and in our society not an issue is going to spark off there. World's media's there. Maybe journalists don't have the right. Put something small by our standards to their standards going to become a political incident. And but the amount of Foreign Office advice. Now, I obviously don't have a passport, so I don't. Obviously, I'm not going to be traveling. But I've had viewers and subscribers to this channel, so that they know people who are going. The amount of money spent, the accommodation isn't great in some places. Lack of hotel space. There's not quite shanty towns, but these temporary structures have been put up, like porta cabins, um, with like temporary B&Bs, and they look like concentration camps. I'm not going to lie, I've seen photos of them. On the outside, on the inside, they actually look quite comfortable, and actually quite nice interior, but on the outside, they don't look overly appealing and overly full of amenities for what you're paying money wise. They're costing like 300 quid a night. So there's definitely a rip off side of this, which you always get in these tourist traps. But there is going to be an incident, yes. How the organisers deal with it and the authorities, because there's overseas police forces and special forces going to be guarding this tournament. There's a high threat of terrorism in the region anyway. There's a high threat of. There's always a hooligan element who are going to do something stupid. There's always that minority that do something stupid. And unfortunately, fans, hooligans, and alcohol don't mix. Sporting events and alcohol are a terrible mix, and we've seen that so many sports events recently. There's been a lot of Foreign Office. I don't know what the Australian Foreign Office advice is, but the UK Foreign Office advice has been very, very strict in what you can and can't do, areas you can and can't go to, staying within fan zones if you are going to be consuming all these things. If you are an unmarried straight couple, if you are a gay couple, if you are a person who's overly religious but not Sunni Islam, because Shiites actually have reduced rights in Qatar as well, ironically. All sorts of advice given out to various people, various communities who are British citizens or travelling under a British passport, for example, dual nationals. Every country that's got fans going has given out this advice. Um, to me, it doesn't seem as a very welcoming tournament, quite frankly. If you're getting that much Foreign Office advice about where to go and what, I wouldn't say Australia been hated. I think that was a decision that the Asian football, is it the AFA? I think it is the Asian Football Association. Um, the confederation. That was agreed between the Australian Federation and the other FAs. They all happily they had to ratify it by vote. It had to be agreed. FIFA had to get involved. Um, but there's been some incidents with Australian fans on the old source. I do think I don't know what the Australian advice is for travelling fans, but I know the British advice has been pretty strict. They're giving out a lot of strong warnings about behaviour and what you can bring into the country, what you can do in the country, what you can't do. A lot of strong um, you know um, hints at what you can and can't do. Now, whether it's a British fan or a German fan or a French fan or a Spanish fan or an American fan or a Canadian, the Canadians haven't been at a World Cup since '86, Football World Cup, that is. And they're generally pretty well behaved as a fan base for every sport. Canadian sports fans internationally are generally some of the best and some of the friendliest and some of the most intelligent as well. Some of these nations haven't been at a World Cup for a while, like Canada, for example. And a lot of Canadians probably haven't been to the Middle East before. There's going to be, yeah, and they're notoriously polite, Canadian. Every Canadian I've met is notoriously polite, and they always apologise even when they're not doing anything wrong. Something's going to happen, and it's going to be a cultural faux pas. It's going to be something trivial that over here is not really an issue. We brush it off and we go. Something's gonna happen, and it's concerning me before the tournament even kicks off. But I'm going to go back to what happened at the World Championship Athletics. Crowd numbers were shockingly poor. They used the National Stadium in Doha, which has also got the athletics track. Um, and the first cut. This is before COVID, and the athletes, when they were being interviewed, like, yeah, the empty stadium was really off-putting. The lack of atmosphere, especially on the prime time events, where normally more fans are in the stadium, which is in the evening. They're like, no, it's weird. It's affecting performance. It's kind of like uncomfortable. Like 60,000 seat stadium with like 2,000 fans in it. They had to pay people to go in to watch. They were actually advertising, get paid X amount per hour to sit there and wave a flag. It was ridiculous. And a lot of the people they paid were actually the workers who were working on the other stadiums for the World Cup to be fans. Ridiculous. Yeah, the Australian government travel advice for Qatar will probably be very similar to the other Commonwealth nations in regards to, yeah, don't be stupid. Literally, it's stating the obvious. Don't have ketamine, cocaine, amphetamine, weed, heroin. Don't bring these things in, because you could face up to 25 years in prison or death. Yeah, because Qatar still has the death penalty. So, you know, there is that to consider. There's other Foreign Office advice, and I've looked at some of the British advice. There's certain Friday's a religious day, obviously, for their faith over there. There's certain things like, don't do this, don't do that. It's basic common sense and common courtesy. It's Yes. I think the UK would have that as well. Um, there's something is going to happen, unfortunately, and it's going to be a high profile incident. And it may start off as something trivial, but then it may get blown out of proportion, or something like a female fan, for example, not wearing a headscarf outside of a fan zone, or something like that, and it dressing modestly is the term. They're expecting about 1.3 million fans to descend um, upon this small nation, which is the population size of Qatar is about 1.3 million. So they're expected to double their population for 6 weeks. The infrastructure isn't going to cope. We know that. That's why they put up these temporary, like, hostel porta cabin type, uh, like basic campsites. When journalists went over there earlier in the year, they were like, "Nothing's ready. Like, there's not enough hotel space for the journalists." Because you've got to think of how many TV companies are going to go, and even the nations that haven't qualified are going to send journalists. Um, all sorts. Also, I mean, so yeah, but for me, um, and also for women to take care. In certain parts of the world, women are known to be more kidnapping targets than men, ironically. And they normally get sold into slavery, and we know what happens there. There are certain staying groups, and to stay in the fan zones and in the tourist and in the marked areas. The advice is pretty much generic for all the Commonwealth nations, although each nation has its own domestic laws that need to be followed as well. But definitely looking at, I generally think those that can afford to go will not be stupid. Let's be frank. They're not the ones that I think they've priced out the hooligan element. And a lot of people on football banning orders or high risk individuals have to surrender their passports from suspension of league play. So if you've had a football banning order, or if you're under investigation for a football offence, you have to surrender your passport should you have one. There are police forces from, I think, 12 nations going to assist with the security operation, including the Turkish Special Forces, and they're not known to be very nice people, um, considering that they've been working fighting a low-level insurgency against the Kurds for 30 years. They're not the nicest people, the Turkish military police. Um, they can be pretty nasty. I think the French are sending over some special gendarmes. We're sending over specialist units. The Germans are sending over some federal police. Um, there's some very high-profile anti-riot and security units that are being sent. Um, on a coord. They did it for Germany in 2006, but this is not like a big thing. This is a regular thing that when international tournaments take place, you will see specialists, security personnel going over there for a variety of reasons, like the Olympics. There will always be special security teams. But the fact that the Turkish special forces have been sent there is these specialise in crowd control, riot control, um, low-level insurgency operations against terrorists. Yeah. Another thing is now with drones more likely to be caught doing something. Yeah, again, look, I I want to focus on the actual sporting, event. I won't be able to watch every game because of my job, which is frustrating, but at the same time, isn't the end of the world. And I do say that honestly, it's not the end of the world. The Rugby League World Cup has given me fatigue. If I'm being honest. I only watched one FA Cup game at the weekend. I'm starting to reach a little bit of not market saturation, but sporting fatigue. Um, so I'm kind of glad that I won't be able to watch all the games. Last year with the Euros, I got mentally fatigued. There was a 2 week spell where I watched every game, and I was like, no, this is actually making me mentally ill. Like I actually felt mentally drained. I know there's other YouTubers that will follow an entire league season, for example, and like the NHL or the NRL, and they will actually do reviews on every single. I don't know how these guys do it. Um, and I watched, I think, 90% of the NRL games this season, and I was between March and October, early October, end of September, I was mentally drained. Um, and that was mentally just absolutely draining. And I wasn't even reviewing every game, I was just watching the games because I'm a fan. I was like, this is actually mentally exhausting. Um, and so, even this Rugby League World Cup, which has had less games, I haven't watched them all. And I'm not, that's no disrespect to a sport that I love. I just haven't watched them all, and it is mentally draining. I've not been as engaged as I have been in past years. Um, Maybe because I'm getting a bit older, I don't know, but because of the amount of content that I've made over the last 5 years, and how intense, like 2018, I watched is I missed like about 45 minutes, 50, an hour of worth of World Cup. So I was channel hopping. I had 2 TVs on at one time. I had one game on one channel, one game on another TV. I would run between 2 rooms. I was keeping up to date. I had both TV. I can't do that. Um, and that was exhausting then. And I was at work. I was in between jobs at the time, so I wasn't overly fast. I was in between jobs at the time, so I had a month solid, pretty much a month, 6 weeks. And then 2 days after the World Cup ended, I started a new job. So I actually had like that entire World Cup 2018 to. I think when the World Cup started, I was still working, and then I was finishing off a contract at one job, and I went to a new job. That's why I had a lengthy period where I was in between jobs, in between contracts for like about a month. That was a very hot summer as well here in the UK. Now, obviously, Australia's had a lot of rain, and I watched a documentary about how the Tongan volcano has actually impacted the weather systems um, with the winds that come off the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean. It's called the SAM, weird, um, and the prevailing winds and El Nino and all that, and how this volcano suddenly caused it to rain like forever. And I'm watching the rugby league this season. That's been interesting. But no, Qatar is I did watch the 2 playoff games to get in when New Zealand lost and Australia won. And I did watch those games, and it was interesting seeing how the players adapted to the conditions, how the pitches were, and you could see even though they were playing in the evening, not in the summer. 'Cause I think it was Easter time. I think. So it was still technically Northern Hemisphere winter. In the days it wasn't peaking. Players were still struggling, and if that would give us an indication. So even then, similar conditions to what we're expecting in a couple of weeks when the tournament kicks off. Players, they were needing water breaks. You could see the players physically struggling. There was one game where they looked more off their feet than I think it was the New Zealand game. They looked more out of it than the Australia-Peru game. They looked absolutely fucked. And I did reviews on both matches. They're on the channel. And it was very obvious that in one game, 24 hours apart, the weather conditions weren't much different. There's a couple of degrees. But that couple of degrees was crucial because there was one game where both sides were literally out on their feet, and the other game, they seemed to adapt a little bit better to it, maybe because they've been out of the country for a day or two longer, a bit of acclimatisation. Obviously, Australia is slightly warmer than New Zealand. Peru is obviously a tropical country. Maybe there was some acclimatisation, but you could see players were fucked, basically, and were struggling with the conditions. And they were just below the threshold for water breaks. So we'll see how that plays out with water breaks, the pace of play. But I do think with high temperatures, high humidity, that kind of fatigue, we could see some very sloppy defending and some sloppy goals. Yeah, I did hear about the T20. England are through to the final. I've got some friends out in Australia right now who are going to go to the T20 final. So already well ahead of you on that one. Big teams, yes, I do think a lot. I do think we're going to see some shocks. I don't know which teams are going to flop, but we're going to see some shocks. I wouldn't be surprised if France don't get out their group because that trend of the World Cup winner 4 years previously losing in the group stage and not being out the group stage has been happening since 2002. France won in 98, 2002 out group stage. 2006, Italy won, didn't get out the group stage. So I think only one World Cup winner since 1998 has then got out the following group stage. I think that's Brazil, 2006. Every other World Cup winner that has won 4 years later fails to get out the group stage or doesn't qualify. So there you go. So I think we're going to see some teams. I think Germany may struggle. They didn't look good at last year's Euros. France didn't look good at last year's Euros. Italy aren't even there. I think Spain. I'm not sold on Spain. I'm really not. So we'll see. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Rain. Well, there's been a lot of I'm surprised this T20 World Cup's even got to completion with how much rain has fallen in southern Western Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, and southern Queensland. I've been looking at the bloody weather in Australia for the best part of 8 months, going how has any sport been played? And I'm a massive fan of the NRL. I love the V8 Supercars. The Bathurst 1000 was almost washed. It was the worst conditions ever raced it. And that's in, obviously, I think the Riverina region in the tablelands of eastern New South Wales. And obviously, I follow, a lot of Australian TV and Australian news. I'm planning to emigrate. Didn't hear that from me. I am planning to emigrate. That's the plan. Hence why I want to change jobs, retrain, and get the skills. So, that's planned for the next year or two. But because the UK is just a mess. Bear that in mind. That's the little secret. So I've been obviously looking at Australia for a while to move to. And I know Australia has a lot of climatic extremes. Obviously, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we're having all the forest fires. We had like the driest October, November, and December, and we had all the forest fires. And I remember watching that when I was in my old apartment. If you remember, I was, this is before COVID hit, so I'd moved in my old apartment, the House of Horrors. And obviously, we had what was happening in Australia. And, watching that on the news and I watched Four Corners on YouTube, and I find that really quite an interesting documentary program. Because every couple of weeks, a new episode gets aired. They do some undercover reporting, that kind of thing, and that was stunning. Like some of the programs I used to watch as a kid, and you're thinking, oh, they're set in these locations, and you're thinking there's ash clouds over Sydney and Brisbane. And one of the programs I used to watch as a kid, which is on Netflix, which I'm currently watching now, which is Heartbreak High, the original series, which is a lot darker than I remember it. I remember it being kind of fun and kind of funky as a kid. No, it's really dark. That should not be rated a 15. That should be rated an 18. There's some really dark storylines in that. Obviously, they filmed it around Manly and Maruba, and I was watching, the news, even over here in the UK, and then on Maruba Beach, and you got these dust clouds. You can see the ash clouds coming in, and it's just mind-boggling. And then, obviously, then you have the flash floods, and of course, I follow the NRL, so I've got my NRL subscription, and I've been watching, the 2020 season. I think there was rain in the first like 12 rounds. There was at least one game affected by rain, and then last season there was a bit of rain, and then this season it's rained a lot, and you can see it when you're watching games. How many games are wet weather games? Yeah, I watched 60 Minutes as well. I'm just because obviously the last like 3 years I've basically lived my life on YouTube, pretty much. The last 3 or so years, I haven't watched a lot of TV, mainstream TV. I have really haven't. Um, it's like I don't miss mainstream TV, if that makes sense. Um, I don't miss the mainstream TV. I don't miss the crappy game shows. I don't miss the TV soap operas. Um, I don't miss the reality TV, which is just brain rot. Absolutely. So I'm a celebrity. Matt Hancock, you Australians, you can keep our former health secretary. You can keep him and feed him to the saltwater crocodiles, please. But this is a thing that I've noticed over a long period, and I've noticed this in the sports journalism. I will get back to Tamori not being selected. I think that's a brain dead decision. Sorry, Southgate. Going with the favourites. Maguire's in that squad. Don't know how. I will select by form, not by favouritism. He is going to get destroyed on social media in the next few hours. Um, oh my God, Southgate was just on the radio doing the press conference. Yeah, it's come up on Sky News because it was on Sky News as well. I follow Sky News and BBC News on YouTube because they've got their YouTube channel where you just get the live feed without all the outbreaks. If he is going to make a political statement, this is going to be the problem. We were discussing this earlier. An instant. Maybe one was if it's a player or a coach making a political statement and angering the officials. And FIFA have said, just get on with playing the football now. Get on with playing the football now. Please get on with. FIFA are praying that the rainbow armbands don't come out. Players don't take a knee and the BLM crap. The the Southgate's got the FA have got to be going. Oh, is the FA is trying to play this tokenist agenda, which does nothing to solve the divisions within society and trying to make it a more inclusive organisation. And the reason why they've gone down this route is they were heavily criticised following Mark Sampson's sacking from the women's position to be replaced by Phil Neville, and now obviously um, the Dutch woman who's obviously just won the Women's Euros. I've forgotten her name now. That's really going to annoy me because she's really good. And they were heavily criticised in a government report at the time. This is under the Theresa May government. The Select Committee on Sport, Media and Culture destroyed the FA, absolutely ripped them to pieces, like completely obliterated them. This is not long after Sam Allardyce was also given the boot for his, how to get round sponsorship and transfer rules and backhand. So the FA was already in a lot of hot water, and they decided to go down this inclusive agenda, right? Without actually the politically correct inclusive agenda, without actually going out and going, well, why are Asian fans are not transitioning into youth players? Why is there still, um, a lack of representation by minority coaches? Why is there that drop off of female participation in sport in general, and why is it more prevalent in the Asian community? They're not actually actually going out into communities with academics, like proper experts in the field of socio macroeconomics and all that, and actually doing proper surveys with clubs as well. Clubs doing their Leicester are one of the best community clubs, by the way. They have the best community involvement. actually partnering up with the club to do community surveys about community engagement. Why is there a drop off? Do we? If they are, they're not doing it very publicly and not doing it very, very well. Um, and when you've got high profile players like Wilfried Zaha going, this is crap. It's more divisive what is currently being pushed than what actually needs doing. And then you have question marks. And this is all realistic. I'm not throwing shade at minority groups. I think they do need to be represented. I do think they need to be supported. I do think they need to be encouraged to coach, work at board level, grassroots, all sorts. Um, there are better ways to do it than what the route the FA has gone down. The FA is basically doing the Murphy rule, which the NFL instituted, which has caused nothing but problems and hasn't solved any of the issues. But you also have to look at how many ex-players at various levels don't get into coaching or give coaching a little try, have a bad experience, and go, you know what, I'm done. I'm not managing or coaching anymore. I'm going to go into punditry or into other business. Get out of the game. And I'm sorry, but if Southgate decides to get all political over there, this is the instant. This could be the moment. That could be the first moment in a lot of instances in this World Cup that could create controversy. And I think he is going to get an official rebuke from the FA. Look, actually, we might have got this wrong. I don't think Southgate's going to be the coach for much longer. I think the public pressure is going to be building. Now, yes, there is a lot of anger with fans about going to this World Cup. There is a lot of criticism of hosting the World Cup. TV viewership will be interesting. The time of year the World Cup is taking place. Are fans going to be engaged this time of year with what's happening economically and socially in this country and around the world, with rising costs, inflation, job insecurity? Are fans really going to be as engaged as they would have been 4 months ago when the World Cup should have taken place? The FA have bandwagoned and done tokenistic champagne socialism, is how I call it, which solves nothing and creates more problems than actually solving anything. And when you've got high profile players and coaches and administrators in the game going, actually, this is becoming more divisive and more of an issue now than what it was before, and no, let's stop. This is not the way to fix the problem. Community engagement is the way to fix the problem. Who knew? Yes, the weather is not predicted to be great over the next little while. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. Gary Lineker, yeah, oops, yeah, a lot of these high profile media personalities, because he's now are really coming out with some absolute brain dead comments that really don't help the situation. The best way to figure out a solution is with community engagement. End of. Tokenistic, PC, wishy-washy, champagne socialist, one-off actions. I'm going to kneel down for 30 seconds for a game, or we're going to wear a rainbow armband. No, community engagement is where you start. And if the clubs and the game, or the sport in general, is not doing that, if it is, it's not doing a very good job. The Kick It Out campaign, and Lord Ousley, there's been question marks over a lot of the dealings financially with that charity, which we've had for years. The Rainbow Laces campaign. Yes, we've now got an openly gay player. It would be interesting to hear his views on the Qatar World Cup, because since he's come out as, I'm gay, whatever, the Blackpool team have gathered round him, the club, the fan base has gone, he's our guy. Doesn't matter. He's our player. Right? There hasn't been a lot of crap that I've seen online aimed at him. He's not even he's not even a high profile player. It does show how far we've come since fashioning in the 90s. I will admit that. And I think Thomas Hitzelsberger coming out just post retirement, I think, has helped because he was a very high profile player in Germany and here. But I think social media's become a problem, and the whole Twitter thing. I'm going to come off Twitter soon. I Elon Musk bought a company he didn't even want to buy. He tried to get out of the deal twice. Um, and the direction, and I'm not even. I've given up on Instagram to a certain point as well. Um, I'm really. I'm starting as I've got a bit older. I've become less. I wouldn't say conservative, but I think I've become more realistic in what's going on. I'm more aware of what's going on. I don't need something twisted on social media that's not fully true. I don't need the crap. I've seen it. There was when the Irish women qualified for their next female women's tournament. Of course, they sung the Wolf Tones song. That's divided a lot of people. And someone from a mixed Anglo-Irish background, and having friends who are Irish and Scottish, and that sectarian side of things. Yeah, there was some real knuckle dragging Catholic and Protestant sectarianism, real knuckle dragging for about 2 weeks, and now my Facebook's gone really quiet. But that was a big thing for a little while. It's gone away now because it's not making the news feed because they qualified. It's gone. They're through to the next tournament. But I think that was a flashpoint in international sport recently. Was Ireland played Scotland in the women's qualifier for the Women's World Cup. Ireland win, and I think question marks have to be asked about why cameras were in the dressing. I don't like cameras in the dressing room for men or women's sport, by the way. I think that's a point where actually get them out of there. I know it's become more commonplace, but get them out of there, please. I wouldn't have thought all the Wolf Tones are a controversial band, and I know enough about Irish history now, controversial Irish history is, and how confusing Irish history is. Just reading up 5 minutes of Irish history, you want to gouge your eyes out and go, "This is a lot," and a little step. But that became a bit of a flashpoint, and social media became a rather toxic melting pot of very ignorant people who were, yeah, stirring it and not contributing to a positive discussion. And and then we've seen incidents with sectarian incidents in Scottish football recently. So yeah, a bit of naivety on the Ireland women players' part there, but they shouldn't have been filmed. But this is the problem with the social media age. Someone filmed that, leaked it on social media, and then the FAI, the Federal Football Association of Ireland, were apologising for an incident that they had no control over. Then they had to drag the captain out and force her to apologise. When in reality, the question should be asked: why was there a camera crew in the dressing room? I'm finding it hard to get engaged with the World Cup. I have for a while. I've done preview video. I might have to do another preview video and break down. I think I have done a preview video. I might reshare that on my socials. Although I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to have my Twitter, to be brutally honest. But I'm finding it hard to be engaged. And well, I'll try and cover it. I will look. I'll watch as many matches as I can and report on as many matches as I can. But I'm finding it hard to be engaged, and I don't really want to be engaged. Um, if I'm being honest, I think a lot of the nations have reservations. I think a lot of players have reservations about being there. I'm surprised players haven't pulled out of squads at this point. We are seeing a lot of injuries, which would actually be minor injuries that could go into a tournament like we did last year with the Euros, where several players weren't fit for a lot of squads that were not played for a game or two. Then they come in for the last group game in squad rotation. I'm surprised players haven't openly said that I'm not going. I've spoken to the man, I've told them to do one. But I'm finding it hard to be really engaged and finding that positive vibe. I really am. I'm not the only one. You're not the only one. I think from what I've seen on social media, a lot of fans are like, I probably will watch a few games, but I'm not feeling the same vibe that we were last year, for example, or in 2018, or in 2014, or in 2016, whatever tournament it's been with fan engagement. And because eh, like places like London and Birmingham and the big cities in the UK or the big cities in Australia or the big cities in the US or Canada, they're very multicultural, multinational, like almost every nationality is represented by at least one person. I think every nation in the world has got at least one resident in London who can hoist their flag. You would have that multi-community engagement where you might have the Turkish community or the French, a small French enclave, or there's a large Italian community in Scotland, and there's a big Macedonian community around here. There's a lot of Macedonian families, for example. When Because it's the global, when you've got global cities like Sydney, like Melbourne, like London, like New York, Paris, Berlin, Munich, with a lot of international businesses and a lot of expats. But what I've seen on social media, I've seen a lot of disengagement for a long time. And as we got closer to the tournament and more things have come out and more statements have been made, it, yeah, it's one of them. I'm going to cover it because there are people who want to watch, and they may not catch every game. You might obviously want to see what I have to say and how I discuss things. And if you like, I'll watch as many games as I can, but I'm not going into this World Cup like I was with Russia or I was with Brazil with a sense of joy. It's the best way to describe it. I'm not going um, um, in regards to I'm looking forward to it. I want to get it out of the way. If I'm being honest, I want to get this tournament out of the way, um, and then just focus on the domestic tournaments, the Champions League final, Europa League final, Conference League final, FA Cup, that kind of thing. It's one of these World Cups that I just want to get out of the way, and then I just want to focus on the sports stories that are going on, like what's happening in the NRL. Are the NRL CBA negotiations, are they really as tense the media is making out, or are there's negotiations taking place? You know, uh, what the next generation of the AFL is going to look like. Obviously, with what's happened with the Hawthorn Hawks, and obviously Gil McLachlan standing down and a new CEO being appointed. Things like that, where there could be positive or negative change, but it's a passionate talking point where there isn't a vested interest as fans and as people who look at it and want to think. Yes, I have seen the 2023 NRL draw, and Brisbane haven't got an easy draw apparently, according to, and also the final ladder is basically copy and paste last year's results. There you go. That's what's going to be the ladder for next year on prediction. Penrith are still the team to beat. How long they can stay at the top with some player turnover this off-season, I think, is bigger than the player turnover from last season. And some of their players haven't fully hit top form at the Rugby League World Cup. There's been some players that look a little bit off colour. We'll see. We'll see what happens with that. I'm also looking forward to see what the AFL draw is going to be, and the V8 Supercars. They haven't fully confirmed all circuits and drivers and teams for next season. There's one more race weekend taking place in December, which is the Adelaide 500 weekend, which is going to take place at the end of the year, but at the end of the year. And also, this is the last time we'll obviously see Holden racing in motorsport before it is replaced by Chevrolet. Obviously, with the Holden brand no longer existing, and I think those cars will then be sold off to private collectors or put in museums. Tamori and Guehi may as well represent Canada and Ghana at this point. This is the problem. We've seen this before, not just with England, but with like countries like France as well, and where a player is eligible, he's talented, and ends up representing another country where he's either eligible by citizenship, like residency, or by parentage. And we could lose out on talented young players that could benefit the nation in the long run because of the coach. But we've seen this before with Southgate, where players have got on now, where players who were more senior players but still useful, like Jamie Vardy, Gary Cahill, and Ben Foster goes, "I'm never playing for England ever again." While that guy's in charge, and now obviously only Vardy's still going at the top level. Foster's now retired, but when you have players having that breakdown, and Jamie Vardy would definitely suit a fast-paced counter-attack team, which is what obviously would suit our style of play. And of course, his form has tailed off a bit. He's obviously not the player he was back in 2018, 2019, 2016. But he's still a useful player. He's good. He's a good depth player to have. But when he's come out and said, "You know what, I don't think I'm going to play for England ever again, although I'm open to returning, but not under that coach." It's kind of a statement. Do I think England getting to the 2018 semi-final was the worst thing that happened? No, I think it was positive growth, but I think it's how we got there, which masks the deficiencies, I think. Yes, getting there was a positive. It's given us a bit of momentum. It's how we got there, which was disguised by the fact we got to a semi-final, disguised the deficiencies um, that the team had. Although the squad then, 4 years ago, or 4.5 years ago, is a lot different to the squad now. There's been a fair bit of player turnover. And unfortunately, a lot of what I would class as senior players aren't around that squad. There's a lot of very inexperienced players at international level um, in the team right now. So I think we are lacking a fair bit of leadership across the team. There's a young, raw, talented squad, and the coach is crap. I think getting to the Euros final last year, the way we played getting to that final was better, but the coach is the problem. The coach has got to change. That Nations League campaign summed up that we have a problem. And while we've done well in the last two major tournaments, and we have made progression, and there actually has been progression, if you notice, from 2018 to 20 last summer, there was positive progression, and a lot of the issues had changed and got better tactically and style of play and substitution wise and managing squad depth. The coach Southgate is the problem, in my opinion. How Ward-Prowse is because he plays for Southampton. Calvin Phillips should never have left Leeds, and he has been injury prone. And Ward-Prowse is a club captain who plays regularly, who's just again Southgate. This is what I don't get. Yes, Southampton have had a poor start to the season. They've just sacked the manager. They've just replaced the manager. Obviously, Hughton-Hartle, not that long ago, signed a 5-year contract extension. So Southampton were going to sack him last year, but that would mean they would have had to pay him out more money. So they've done a bit of business. But, Ward-Prowse hasn't, his club team haven't had their start to the season, but he regularly plays at a standard level. He's very consistent. And on set plays, he is lethal. How he's not getting in the side. It's like Matt Letizia in the 90s. Because he's playing for a Southampton side that is lower mid-table at best at the moment. Now, new manager, maybe new direction, but it's because the club he plays for, not the player that he is, and that is a problem. And Phillips, he's got no match fixes, that's a brain dead decision. And they play different roles in the midfield. That's a brain dead decision. But hey, this is the problem with Southgate. This is the problem with Gareth Southgate. You've got a proven leader in James Ward-Prowse, who's also a club captain, and a great set piece taker. And then you've got Calvin Phillips, who is a very good player. He's had a lot of injury disruption over the last year a bit since the Euros, and he's barely played. Go with the player reform. Go with the consistent fit player who's a leader, which the team clearly lacks in that. That's the ridiculous. That's something that I just cannot get my head around. The Rugby League Ashes. I would love to see a 3-test series between England and Australia, or Great Britain and Australia again, or Great Britain or England and New Zealand. Although we did have a 3-test series against New Zealand in 2018, which England easily dominated that one. They made a lot of changes for the third test. If they just stuck with the strong side, they would have whitewashed New Zealand back in 2018. Um, I would like to see an Ashes series where either we go down under for a three-test tour, or they come up here for a three-test tour. We need more consistent international rugby league. That's something that I think this World Cup has highlighted is the lower nation, the lesser nations, the developing nations need to have more test matches together. And even the bigger nations like Australia, New Zealand, ourselves, getting those combinations and getting those. Rugby league is one of those international sports at that level that's been heavily disrupted by COVID. Um, So again, that's another watch this space, wait and see kind of thing. But the International Rugby League, the IRL, doesn't have a lot of money. Um, there's too many voices in the room, and it's not got the same organisation as World Rugby or FIFA. It's got a small. It's badly administered. Um, the driving force behind rugby league is the NRL and the Australian, reserve grade, Queensland Cup, New South Wales Cup, and then state competitions and junior grades. No, there's not the talent depth. Obviously, France hosts the World Cup in 3 years' time, and in 2025. Um, there is now a domestic competition in Italy. There is a domestic competition in France outside of Toulouse and Catalan. So we are seeing progress. There's now a domestic competition in Greece. We are seeing progress in Europe, outside of England and France. We are seeing that progress. Even Jamaica's now got a domestic competition. They need to come up to a standard, and there needs to be cooperation with the bigger nations like New Zealand, Australia, and ourselves, the UK. So I'm including Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, although that comes under Ireland. But the bigger nations, the stronger nations, to support growth in the emerging nations globally. And I think the driving force behind that has to be Australia, because I cannot see looking at this World Cup. And while we've seen some real feel good stories with Jamaica making their first World Cup, Greece making their first World Cup, the Women's World Cup has actually been quite fun to watch. The crowd numbers have been poor. The opening ceremony was a farce, and the 2017 tournament was a better tournament. Yes, we've had bigger crowd numbers because we've used bigger stadiums for the England games. That's it. And in my opinion, I don't think the promotion of the sport was great. I think we've got the advertising for it. The promotion wasn't good enough. Ticket price has been a problem. I don't think the weather conditions have helped. The RFL and the International Rugby League have made a bit of a mess of some of the organisation side of this tournament, some of the promotion of this tournament, the pricing of the tournament, the merchandise, ticketing, like access, and some of the players look very, very tired. They've had very long seasons. The Super League and NRL players, especially those higher level players, they've had a shortened last off season because of the last two off seasons, actually because of COVID. They've had a lot of rearranged fixtures. There's they both sets of NRL and Super League players, they look tired. And part of the reason is if they played it last year, they had a bit more flexibility. They could have started a little bit later, had a bit more rest. Qatar World Cup, the clash of TV, the clash of all the BBC crews or the global TV crews having to go to Qatar, so the media availability. That was a fear. They've had to shift it forward a little bit, less, rest and recuperation from grand finals, long seasons. And already training camps have started for those players who are already, back in at clubs. Like they're already in pre-season. So these guys are knackered. you know, that's a problem. We need to look at the club calendar, whether the English competition or the European competition should go back to a winter competition. And, you know, um, because the Challenge Cup will be starting not long after the tournament ends. So there is a question mark about whether we should go back to a winter competition here in the Northern Hemisphere. Um, and that's been questioned for a while. I think that's another reason why we're seeing problems. Um, whole, I don't. At some point, I hope to see like a Four Nations or a Tri Nations on a regular end of season in between World Cup cycles, where those teams that may have made quarterfinals or semi-finals that don't have to qualify for the World Cup play like a mini couple of tournaments, um, like two tournaments or something. Um, but there isn't the quality depth outside of England, Australia, and New Zealand. Tonga and Samoa and Fiji notwithstanding, and PNG to a point, there just isn't. There isn't player depth for that. And a lot of the Samoan and Tongan and PNG players can also play for Australia and New Zealand and Fiji. They can and the eligibility rules for international selection need looking at. And that we've had players play for, like, some players have played for three different nations like Samoa, New Zealand, and Australia, for or Tonga, for instance. There has to come a point where we have to think, hang on a second, this is getting a bit ridiculous now, and not necessarily a good thing. Dom Young, if the World Cup takes place last year, he plays alongside his brother for Jamaica. So does Callum Watson. Like, it's one of them. Um, so questions do have to be asked of certain aspects of the international game. And yeah, I am openly critical of the crowd numbers at the World Cup. I don't think they've been great. It's a bad look for TV. Um, you know, not taking as many more games to the Midlands and the south of England, I think, is a mistake. I think it was a great chance to grow the game to a wider, possibly more affluent audience that would have actually helped with finances um, of the game. Um, and because the tournaments have to take place a little bit earlier than what they intended in the calendar year, because of the Football World Cup, the players are looking a little bit more fatigued and less rested. And already, players teams who've been knocked out are going into pre-season, so they're not really rested. Like, some of these guys haven't really had that time off because they've now got to go into their pre-season training, which is ridiculous. Had the World Cup take place at the correct time last year, there would have been that extra week of rest before the tournament, and the pre-season would have started a little bit later. But I understand the reasons why. I understand that, yes, in hindsight, it was the correct decision to postpone it. Um, the way, as I say, it was handled with Australia and New Zealand was not great, and I do believe the players weren't fully consulted. It was a very, very reactionary decision at the time. Not long before the tournament started last year, there was a lot of, panic surrounding it, um, and I think that's actually benefited some players playing it a year later with player development, which is great. Other players have obviously had to retire because of injury, which is a shame. But with where the game is at, no, I don't think we're ready for a Six Nations in rugby league. Um, we've got enough problems with rugby union Six Nations. Let's, and I do think a lot of that lies with the International Rugby Board and both the NRL and Super League competitions. And as I say, while I've enjoyed the tournament, there's been too many blowout games, and players are looking physically out on their feet. Because of the disrupted schedules over the last nearly 3 years now, players look like they are struggling, and that's not a good thing. That the players are looking not 100%. Some players are really looking off. Other players have had fantastic tournaments. Other players have not stepped up to the plate from what we expect. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Obviously, we've got the last women's group games tonight. The Cook Islands are going to be playing I think the French, and Australia are playing New Zealand. So that's going to be really good to see those two matches. And then the semi-finals, we've got a semi-final tomorrow night and a semi-final on Saturday. And then Sunday, I think, is a rest day. And then the women's semi-finals take place next week. And then obviously we've got the finals, both finals take place next weekend, double header. So the tournament's now winding down. And then literally as soon as the Rugby League World Cup's done, within a few days, the Football World Cup starts. And then we can have a discussion in regards to, is it going to be a controversial World Cup? Is Gareth Southgate going to make a political statement that could backfire? Are some of the players going to make statements or gestures that could backfire? Are the fans actually going to behave? Is there going to be a journalistic incident where, something? But this thing called fan disengagement, we saw it with the Olympics, with Tokyo, where the Japanese public weren't behind it, and they were the ones bloody hosting the thing. I do think there's a bit of I wouldn't say market saturation, but I do think there's a certain amount of fatigue, and with the politicisation of sport, it's becoming a problem. And something else that I haven't actually covered is the Boston Bruins Miller situation, which is developed, and it is now transpired that there was a series of incidents at junior level where Miller racially and physically bullied another young player over a protracted period of time. And then what's obviously happened this week with over the last week or so, being offered an entry level contract and all this, and then the fallout from that has been very, very noticeable. And there's been a lot of calls on the GM and the head of hockey operations to resign. And we're seeing a few of these negative stories popping up about the culture within the sport of ice hockey in North America, predominantly through the US and Canadian junior systems. And what we've seen over the summer and into the autumn with Hockey Canada and the allegations that are coming out about that organisation, how they dealt with certain incidents or covered up or paid off people. And now what's coming out about certain individual players, past and present, and coaches, raises concerns about the culture within a sport that has come a long way with inclusivity. But there's been several high-profile scandals involving governing bodies and individual players, off-ice incidents, World Championship, World Junior Championship incidents, and things like that, and the culture within the sport. Admittedly, several years ago, and it's maybe not happening right now, but it's historical stories that are coming out about that particular sport in North America, and the behaviour of players and the behaviour of coaches and the behaviour of administrators, and there are things coming out that are troubling reading. And this is following on from the Chicago Blackhawks scandal and who knew what. And it has cost people their jobs. And now sponsors are like, we're going to withdraw our sponsorship. And it's become an ongoing issue. So there is that. and that's something that I haven't covered as much, because how do you cover that? I mean, how do you talk about that? I mean, it's troubling that one of my favourite sports and one of my favourite leagues that I follow is being constantly having these negative repeat. It's the same issues. It's culture. It's to do with culture. Abuse allegations, racism allegations, sexism allegations, and it's the same time frame. It's the same period of time, of a 10, 20-year period, and it's focusing on this period of time. And that says to me that something has gone wrong then, that down the line, there's knee-jerk reactions taking place to what happened then. However, what happened then should not have happened then. And while it may not be happening now, there are people in positions in the administrative side of the sport who were either involved as players or coaches back then that could have done something then, that are now in positions of authority in the sport now, that are hushing it up or not taking accountability when they should have done. So it's that's something that is troubling me. And then obviously what we have with the NRL CBA negotiations, when they are that's a concern that we could see deadlock in Australia in the rugby league at a time when the expansion's back on the agenda, and the league plans to expand yet again within the next couple of years, maybe as early as not 2023 but 2024, so the next full season. There's proposals to get the North Sydney Bears back into the competition, whether that's the right or wrong way to go about it. Should they look at Western Australia with Perth or Adelaide or South Island of New Zealand? So to make it an 18-team competition. And there are players making statements going, we're not happy with the direction the negotiations are taking, etc., etc. And then you're thinking to yourself, well, there's a World Cup going on right now. Let's get the World Cup played and focus on playing. So there's that backdrop to things. Obviously, the AFL's had a lot of negative headlines with the Hawthorn Hawks scandal, amongst other scandals. Several high-profile players and ex-players and commentators said, while it's an idealistic goal, it's a utopian goal, so to speak. It's a goal they want to have. They're not even close. Not even close. Let's not even try and throw things out there that are going to fail, because that will fail. The infrastructure isn't in place. The average income and the corporate money is not in place. It's a developing nation still. There's a long way to go. We're talking 20, 30 years down the line. Player development and pathways is what they are doing very, very well, and it's paid off with the national side of both men's and women's games in the last 10 or so years. But having a first grade team in Port Moresby is not close, and in my opinion, it's quite frankly ridiculous. In my opinion, I would say yes. I would agree. 10 years at the earliest to consider it as a feeder club for, let's say, the 4 Queensland sides, for example. Have an arrangement with Queensland Rugby League for the 4 NRL sides in Queensland to get a couple of players each season to go into their reserve grades. Something like that would make sense. But no, that's some of these people, while they have great ideas, are still living in the realm of fantasy. Like R.R. Martin and Tolkien would be pretty happy with some of those storylines. And yes, we've got some great players who play for PNG, the Cummels. And when you've got just players like Justin Holland going, this is a fantasy idea. We need to continue to focus on player development pathways and working with the existing NRL structures and with the New South Wales and Queensland Rugby League and those structures to put the pathways in place, talent spotting in place to bring those players into the fold in the NRL system is a far better way of doing it than just putting a team out there and expecting it to work, because it won't. It just the infrastructure there isn't in place. The country is a very poor country. Um, the it doesn't work. It's like when they say we should have a team in Tonga or Samoa Fiji or Pacific Island team. Again, the economics don't make sense. Super Rugby's finding that out. Rugby Union's finding that out. It doesn't. I mean, they can't even get a team in New Zealand to really be competitive. They've had nearly 25 years of doing that, plus. Admittedly, the Warriors have never had the wooden spoon, which I find fantastic. Weirdest overseas team that I was ever had was the Singapore Slingers. But look, I mean, Australia is such a vast country with actually, ironically, a very small population that's actually smaller than Canada, which is ironic. Australia is a continent. Country is a massive continent. But you cannot call it the NRL until you've got representation at professional level at first grade in at least Western Australia and South Australia, maybe the Northern Territory. How can you call yourself a national competition when it's really only played in 2 and a bit states and a location in New Zealand? How can the NRL call itself a national competition? The AFL can. The NRL cannot. It really is an East Coast league, and that is a problem. Even though there are players, there's about 4 or 5 players that have actually come through Western Australia that are playing in the NRL, and I think there's about 6 or 7 players this World Cup that were born in Western Australia. There's a good state league in Western Australia, but until they go, right, we're going to Perth, we're going to Adelaide, we're putting teams there. Whether you relocate teams from Sydney or Queensland, go right, you're going there. Or they expand there in the future, make it a 20-team league, for example. They cannot call themselves a national competition. They really can't. And yes, they may go up and take state of origin there every other year. And we play test matches, but that's fine. Until you have a professional first grade team that is playing in the same competition as the teams in Sydney and Queensland, or New South Wales and Queensland and Melbourne, you cannot call yourself a national competition when you have no team in Adelaide, no team in Perth, and occasionally you take road games to the Northern Territory. You cannot. That to me is the problem. They are far too East Coast centric, um, and they are limiting the player pool and the fan base by being so. Because there are rugby league fans in Perth. There are rugby league fans in Adelaide. Okay, maybe not as much in the same numbers in Adelaide, but there are. And ignoring those markets to focus on bringing back the North Sydney Bears, really? Really? Yes, there used to be state of origin games. Yes, they did. That's an irony as well. I think the AFL can truly call itself a national competition. The AFL has problems, um, and more problems than it cares to admit. And there is a big substance abuse issue problem within the AFL of predominantly hard drugs. And it's more than just Ben Cousins. I think who's that guy on Triple M, the radio presenter who's had multiple drug infractions and drinking infractions. And the AFL's got a lot of problems, and it's one of those sports leagues where it's in denial about the drug use issue within the sport, within the league. And Ben Cousins, they never caught him on a drugs test, ever. It was so blatantly obvious for the best part of like 15 years that this guy is clearly got an addiction issue, and it made national news over here. It was big news globally because of the high profile nature of the situation. And the AFL has a problem. So does the NRL to a certain extent. Recreational drug use, more than just steroids, is an issue, and it's something that isn't going away, and you know it's become so regular that it's no longer sensationalized in the media. But there's sort of like this, oh, it's happened again. Oh well, it's like the NFL in the US. There's a website you can go on where you can have a look at what players have got criminal charges outstanding against them or felonies, which is ridiculous. It's become so commonplace of misdemeanor offences, felony offences, criminal. There's different grading of criminality, right? That the NFL, there is a dedicated website to looking at active players who've got active criminal cases against them or charges against them for a variety of offences, like DUIs to firearms offences to drugs to all. It's become so commonplace that it's no longer a scam. I forget the name of the website, but it's no longer a scam because it's such an everyday occurrence now that the public and the media have gone, okay, it's a thing. That's the state that some sports have got to with, you know, the player misbehaviour or chief executive misbehaviour, administrators misbehaviour. When it's got to the point where it's an everyday occurrence that, so and so is being charged with DUI. Okay, drink driving happens and it's silly and it happens. Or unpaid parking tickets. It happens. And then you get to the more serious domestic violence cases and the drug possession charges and firearm. You're thinking, shit, these are serious things that if you or I were to, we don't have the money to pay for them. We're doing time. And you're thinking, this is serious shit. And it's gotten to that level. And the AFL is going down the same path. And has been doing for quite some time. The sport, rugby league, is in denial as well about the recreational illicit drug use. If I was in the US, I'll probably follow baseball, because I have a face of fast pitch. Baseball is a sport with problems, massive problems, and coming off the back of that lockout, which delayed the start of the season by a couple of weeks and delayed preseason, and how there was no negotiating in good faith. A lot of negative headlines came. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a player strike or another lockout or a disagreement over the next renegotiation of the CBA. It's the only major sport in the US and Canada without a salary cap of any kind, just a luxury tax. It's definitely got an aging, declining fan base. There's definitely a disengagement between younger fans or those who could become sports fans. There's definitely a disengagement there, where potential fans have been put off for whatever reason, and they're choosing other sports that are either more exciting or more engaging. There's been a fair few scandals that have really rocked the sport. But there is definitely a disengagement between potential fans and existing fans and the league. And read into that what you will, but attendances have not been great. Viewership figures aren't necessarily great either. And when surveys are done, younger people are switching to other sports or switching off sport entirely. But generally, baseball, the average age of a fan is above average for a match-going fan, or a registered member, or someone who identifies with a team, or who has been to games. The average age of a fan in attendance at stadiums is higher. They're generally of a higher income bracket as well, so there's less working class fans, and younger fans are staying away. So baseball has got problems, and there's been a lot of negative headlines about Major League Baseball over recent years. And I don't think the lockout helped. The negotiations during COVID 2.5 years ago for the return to play negotiations were not in good faith, which ultimately led to the lockout um, last winter over Christmas. I call it the Christmas lockout because it happened, started in December, around my birthday, and it carried on to about March, April time. So it was the longest lockout in history. Um, Ultimately, it cost no game time, but it was a lengthy, protracted lockout where at periods they weren't even negotiating. They weren't. There was one meeting where they were in the room together for 7 minutes. And they just walked out. One side just walked out and went, "No, we're not talking today. We're not on the same wavelength. Not interested." And walked out of the room. So there is definitely issues from the top down within the sport. Um, I've got nothing against baseball, but it's not a sport that grabs me either. I think it's too slow paced. I think it's definitely it, it's a sport with a lot of negativity as well. When you're looking at that as a potential, you think, like, do I really want to watch this? Do I really want to spend my money when there's so many issues that are being publicly played out on a very public forum, such as social media and the mainstream media. And basketball with the sport in the US that I would less likely to follow. I never enjoyed playing it, so that's why I tuned out. I've got nothing against how athletic you've got to be as a basketball player and the fitness and the cardio you've got to have and the physicality you've got to have for it. Um, it's a reasonably popular sport in Australia. It's got a decent following and a decent professional league. Here in the UK, it hasn't really gone anywhere. Um, and when we always talk about like Olympic legacies or sporting legacies after a major tournament or a major Commonwealth Games or Olympic Games, the UK funding body cut the funding for basketball um, in after the 2012 Olympics. So there is that. Yeah, basketball for some reason it's worked in Australia. I think it's the proximity to the US. And I think World War II and the Cold War with a lot of US personnel stationed and transient through Australia over a very long period of time has had something to do with baseball and basketball being quite popular um, in Australia, and they've got a big TV deal as well on ESPN. So it is very very popular over there. Um, and there's been a fair bit of investment. The women's program is very very good. There's some high profile female players, and there's a lot of Europeans where basketball is quite popular, like Italians, Greeks, and the Balkan nations, where it's a very popular sport. You have large communities in Melbourne and Sydney as well, where it's a very popular sport back home. So they've taken that culture with them. Um, so yeah, there is a certain degree of that. It's obviously much better, marketed to the Australians as well. Um, so there are things that the Australian domestic league has definitely done. The NBA is definitely aware that there's a big fan base and a big market over there. Definitely aware. Some top Australian players have gone to play in the NBA and gone to college in the US to play. One of them ended up, one of the US collegiate basketball players ended up playing AFL. He's now playing for the Collingwood Magpies, which is an interesting story. So yeah, there are definitely conversations to be had where a non-traditional sport in a market can suddenly get a foothold and become quite popular, such as baseball and basketball in Australia. It's worked. And there's other reasons why it hasn't necessarily worked here in the UK. Now, funding is a big issue, and it's something that obviously here in the UK has been drawn from basketball at grassroots level, which is a massive mistake. Major League Baseball coming here now could be a positive, it could be a negative. It's a wait and see how that plays out, but we'll see. But In regards to the Major League Baseball series, I've done a lot of videos on the 2019 series, a lot of videos on the coming series in 2023, 2024, and 2026, but they're not coming in 2025, which I find very interesting. That they're coming 3 out of the next 4 years, but they're missing a year. So that's interesting. I believe it's to do with a CBA negotiation as well, possibly. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Major League Baseball London series plays out. Um, and if they've learnt the lessons from 2019, because I don't think using Jimmy Carr as part of the advertising campaign won a lot of people over. The broadcasting, I don't think won a lot of people over. And the use of taxpayer money on the stadium to modify the playing surface, a lot of people didn't realise. And if they were aware of it, I'm not sure they would be in favour of the series as much. So there are things to definitely consider in regards to the baseball, for example, in the UK and the London series. Now, about 30% of the fans that turned up in 2019 were overseas fans. Yeah, a third of the stadium. That's interesting. The fact that the large majority were local British fans is fantastic. However, still a third of that stadium was overseas. So let that sink in. I don't think it's going to be as successful as the NFL Europe series, as I'm going to call it now, with games in Munich as well now. I don't think it's going to be on the same level as that. I think the Major League Baseball have left it too long, honestly. I think they should have come earlier to the UK. I do think Major League Baseball has left it too long to branch into the European market. And they're on the back foot because the other major leagues have been coming to Europe for decades between them, honestly. Like the NHL and NBA have been coming here for a long, long time. And the predominantly in preseason, but still they've been taking exhibition games or regular season games here for a long time. The NFL has been consistently coming here since 2007. Major League Baseball's well behind the curveball on that one, and we'll have to see if how it plays out next summer. We really will. But yeah, we'll see how it all plays out, and if it is as successful as they hope it will be, and if it does the job they intend, which is to increase the fan base, grow the international fan base, grow the brand positively, and we'll see. But I think, in comparison to the other major leagues, they are slow on the uptake and behind the curve. That's my opinion on Major League Baseball and their European London series. That's my opinion. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there. Thank you very much for participating. A lot of good questions. Obviously, my poll obviously did quite well. With half of respondents going for Australia winning the Rugby League World Cup. So there we go. I'm going to call that a stream. Thank you very much for all your questions. Hour until the first women's test match this evening and the end of the group stages in the Rugby League World Cup. So thank you very much. I'll have some more content for you very, very soon. Obviously, we've got the first men's semi-final tomorrow, which will be a tasty encounter. And of course, we've got the second semi-final on Saturday. And then Sunday's obviously Remembering Sunday, so nothing's taking place. And then obviously we have both finals double heading next weekend at Old Trafford. So that's going to be really interesting. So from me, thank you very much for watching and asking all your questions, and I'll have some more content for you very, very soon.